So I took my snake arm running to the forest like I do every time.
Hello, my name is Michael Zantowski, and today we are going to discuss human rights, civil society and civic responsibility and what it all has to do with this man.
Svou draze vykoupenou svobodu, nezávislost a znovu se rodící demokracii si už vzít nedáme.
I know him. That's Václav Havel.
Almost, but it's actually pronounced Václav Havel.
Oh, right. Yes, the former president of Czechoslovakia.
Yes and no. It was Czechoslovakia, but it's been the Czech Republic since 1993.
Oh, you could have told me.
Well, we're standing here in that country right now, in Prague, in this cool building called the National Technical Library. I'm Molly, by the way, the smart American one.
And I'm Matt, the British one, the handsome one.
You may ask why it's important to talk about some guy from Central Europe.
Yeah, I was a bit embarrassed to ask.
Well, thank goodness I'm here. You see, if we fail to understand what happened 50 years ago, why people from this part of Europe suffered under a totalitarian communist regime with their rights totally suppressed, it may happen again. To us, to you, to any country in the world. Just like everyone else, Havel was influenced by his family and the time he was born in. The year is 1936. TV signals can be received in Czechoslovakia for the first time. Charlie Chaplin premieres his Modern Times, and the man who will become today's Pope Francis is born.
And that's the very same year Václav Havel is born, into a wealthy entrepreneurial family.
Václav Havel's grandfather built one of the oldest cinemas in Prague. Václav Havel's uncle built the first film studios in the country.
The little Václav grows up in material and intellectual luxury, and he's surrounded by the most prominent intellectuals of his time. But this ends in 1948, when Havel is just 12 years old.
After World War II, the Soviet Union treats Eastern Europe, including Czechoslovakia, as its conquered territories and promotes a totalitarian communist regime here. With Russian support, the communists seize power in Czechoslovakia in the February coup, which dramatically changes everyone's lives. Havel's family is stripped of its property, as is everyone from the rich to the smallest business owners. Everything is now owned by the state.
In the blink of an eye, the family has lost its social status and influence. In the cinema they built, they can be nothing more than employees or guests. Quite depressing. He couldn't even buy popcorn.
The Communist Party controls every aspect of life. For instance, people are told where they have to work after graduating. Most of them are unable to decide for themselves.
But it's a great paradox that in the same year that the communist dictatorship seizes power here, most of the states joining the UN sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm curious, Molly. And when I'm curious, I don't use books. I use my phone. Article 5, torture prohibited.
Right, but from 1948, torture is an ordinary tool of the communist regime.
Okay, Article 13, everyone is granted the right to leave his country.
But anyone wanting to leave the country here runs the risk of being shot dead. We could go on like this for ages. The Declaration has 30 articles. Basically, none of them are valid in communist Czechoslovakia. Plus, there's no rule of law enabling a person to invoke their rights before an independent court.
Every day I hear someone say, "I've got rights, don't you know?" But how can someone learn what their rights are? I mean, what are their human rights?
Well, the term human right is related to the other term right, meaning correct. So maybe you can remember that it's correct or right for every person to have human rights.
Yes, that's why I'm part of the Flying Spaghetti Monsters.
Are you?
Yes.
Okay.
You can't take away that right.
That's true, because when everyone has the right to certain things, these are fundamental human rights.
But still, there are huge differences in cultures all around the world, so how can a right be shared by all?
Think of the basic universal human rights as freedoms. You have a right to life, right to speak freely and travel freely, to choose your government, your faith, your way of life.
I'm starting to get it a bit now. So the fundamental human rights, such as freedom of speech, creed, or movement we've just mentioned, simply aren't upheld in early communist Czechoslovakia. People suddenly find themselves behind the impenetrable Iron Curtain.
And Havel is a teenager in the 50s, the harshest decade. People who openly stand up against the communist government end up in the mines or in prison.
There's fear everywhere, and the regime executes dozens of people in political trials.
Children from formerly wealthy families are not allowed to study, so grammar school is out of the question for Václav Havel because of his class origins, which he didn't choose. Instead, he becomes a chemical laboratory assistant.
However, Havel finds his own way. He writes various texts about art and literature, and also poems. He goes to the Slavia Cafe in Prague, which is the meeting place for intellectuals back then. I go there myself sometimes, but there's no more intellectuals, mostly just old ladies.
By the time he's 23, Havel has already published articles on theater, literature, and film in the greatest art magazines.
I bet you've read them all.
Maybe a few. And since his youth, he's been surrounded by people with similar interests, friends who share the same views of the world. This is a trait which will count in the future.
He reads a lot and he is keenly interested in the world around him. He visits forbidden writers and poets. He does not let the regime log him in a cage.
In 1956, at a time when people are afraid to even show up, the 20-year-old Václav has his first public performance. At a meeting of official pro-regime writers, he advocates authors who have been condemned. The only thing I did at 21 was organise a pub crawl.
Well, fortunately for everyone, Havel is different. And he continues in this way. In all his public appearances, he recalls other colleagues, poets and writers who have been imprisoned for their works or cannot publish books.
His criticism slowly turns from literature to politics and even social circumstances.
Again and again, Havel stands up and speaks out whenever he feels that an injustice is being committed.
Even though he cannot study what he wants for long, he does not give up.
Eventually, he graduates from evening grammar school and, after much trouble, also completes a course at the Faculty of Theatre. And slowly, taking the back door, he gets into theatre. First, he's a stagehand, but over time, he establishes himself as a dramaturge and eventually as an author.
Right. The regime prohibits Havel from studying normally, but unwillingly lets him become educated as what they called a lifelong opponent of totality. He learns to write, speak, and argue, and masters the elements of political strategy. Now we've gradually moved to the 60s, and Havel is approaching 30. The political situation here and all over the world begins to thaw. A new generation with a more liberal idea of life grows up. Hair gets longer, skirts get shorter. There's increasing room for artistic and personal freedom. In the USA, it's the time of the hippie movement. In Czechoslovakia, it's a golden era for film and literature.
It's also good for Václav Havel, who does well in the theatre. He becomes a reputed playwright and works for one of the most famous Prague theatres of that time.
Zahradní slavnost Václava Havla slaví úspěch. Je aktuální, má humor. Mladým divákům se líbí kritika nesmyslných mechanismů nesmyslného režimu. O zahradní slavnosti se píše pochválně i v oficiálním tisku.
Havel is even a rising star abroad, and also around this time he gets married to his long-time friend Olga. The future is bright.
But the joy doesn't last long. In fact, it's the quiet before the storm.
But more about that next time.
See ya!